A powerful executive humiliates a man for looking poor, not knowing he owns the entire company. What happens next will restore your faith in justice. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Enterprises' 42nd floor, each droplet creating intricate patterns that seemed to mirror the chaos brewing inside the conference room. The morning light struggled to penetrate the gray clouds hanging over downtown Chicago, casting everything in a somber, almost ominous hue that would prove prophetic for what was about to unfold. Marcus Chen stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb steadily toward his destination. His clothes were still damp from the storm outside, his simple jacket bearing water stains, his worn shoes leaving small puddles on the polished floor. He hadn't expected the weather to turn so violently during his morning walk around the neighborhood where he'd grown up, just a few miles from the gleaming corporate tower that now housed his life's work. At 38, Marcus had built Meridian Enterprises from nothing into a multinational corporation worth billions. But today, he looked nothing like the polished executives who populated his building. His hair was disheveled from the rain, his clothes modest and unpretentious. He carried himself with quiet dignity, but to anyone who didn't know better, he might have been mistaken for someone from the building's maintenance crew. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor with a soft chime. Marcus stepped out into the pristine hallway, his wet shoes squeaking slightly against the marble floor. He was headed to Conference Room A, where the monthly leadership meeting was already underway. As the actual owner of the company, he rarely attended these meetings, preferring to let his management team operate independently. But recent reports of workplace culture issues had prompted him to observe today's session firsthand. He paused outside the conference room, where voices carried through the partially open door. The meeting had clearly begun without him, which was exactly what he'd hoped for. He wanted to see how his executives behaved when they thought no one was watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a sharp, authoritative voice that Marcus recognized as belonging to Victoria Sterling, the vice president of operations. "I want to address the elephant in the room. This company's image is everything. We represent excellence, sophistication, and success. Every person in this building is a reflection of our brand." Marcus frowned. This wasn't the agenda item he'd expected to hear. "Which brings me to a concern I've been meaning to raise," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "The caliber of people we're allowing in this building has declined significantly. I've noticed individuals who clearly don't belong in our professional environment. People who look unprofessional, unsuitable. Frankly, some of them look like they belong on the street rather than in our offices." Through the crack in the door, Marcus could see Victoria standing at the head of the polished conference table, her perfectly styled hair catching the artificial light. She was addressing 12 other executives, all nodding along with her words. The sight made something cold settle in Marcus's stomach. "I think we need to implement stricter dress codes and appearance standards," Victoria continued. "Not just for employees, but for anyone who enters this building. Vendors, delivery people, cleaning staff, everyone. If they can't meet our standards, they shouldn't be here." Daniel Rodriguez, the director of human resources, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Victoria, I appreciate your concern about professionalism, but we need to be careful about discriminatory policies. Appearance-based restrictions can quickly become problematic from a legal standpoint." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Daniel, please. I'm not talking about discrimination. I'm talking about basic standards. Would you want someone who looks homeless representing your company? Would you want clients to see unprofessional individuals wandering our halls?" "But who decides what's professional?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the marketing director, her voice uncertain. "Sometimes the most talented people don't fit traditional corporate molds. Anyone with eyes can tell the difference between professional and unprofessional," Victoria snapped. "It's common sense. If someone looks like they can't afford decent clothes, if they appear unkempt or unsuitable, they don't belong in our environment. Period." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd built this company on principles of merit and inclusion, believing that talent came in many forms. Hearing his own vice president advocate for judging people based on appearance was deeply disturbing. "I think Victoria has a point," interjected Robert Kim, the chief financial officer. "Our building security should be more selective about who they allow access. We can't have just anyone walking around here." "Exactly," Victoria said, her confidence growing. In fact, I've already spoken to security about being more vigilant. I've instructed them to question anyone who looks suspicious or out of place. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. All heads turned as Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside, water still dripping from his jacket onto the expensive carpet. The room fell silent. Every executive stared at this unexpected visitor, a man who clearly didn't belong in their pristine corporate environment. His wet, casual clothes and slightly disheveled appearance stood in stark contrast to their pressed suits and polished shoes. Victoria's eyes immediately narrowed with disgust and indignation. She straightened to her full height, her expression transforming into one of barely contained outrage. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp with authority. "This is a private meeting. How did you get past security?" Marcus stood quietly in the doorway, water pooling at his feet. He looked around the room at the faces staring back at him, some curious, some annoyed, but all clearly viewing him as an intruder who didn't belong. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that somehow felt out of place given his appearance. "I was hoping to observe the meeting." Victoria's laugh was harsh and incredulous. "Observe the meeting? Are you serious? This is an executive leadership meeting for senior management only. Who exactly do you think you are?" The other executives exchanged glances, some looking amused, others appearing uncomfortable with Victoria's aggressive tone, but none of them spoke up to intervene. "I understand your concern," Marcus replied, remaining composed despite the hostility radiating from Victoria. "But I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding here," Victoria said, stepping closer to him with intimidating intent, "is you thinking you have any right to be in this room. Look at yourself. Look at this mess you're making on our carpet." She gestured dramatically at the small puddles of water that had dripped from his clothes. "You're dripping all over our conference room like some kind of vagrant who wandered in from the street." Marcus felt every eye in the room examining his appearance, judging him based solely on his wet clothes and modest presentation. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain continuing to pelt the windows. "Victoria, maybe we should—" Daniel Rodriguez started to say, but Victoria cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, Daniel. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is the perfect example of what's wrong with our building security." She turned back to Marcus, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sir, I don't know how you got past the front desk, but you clearly don't belong here. This building houses a prestigious corporation, not a homeless shelter." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He'd heard plenty of criticism in his business career, but he'd never been spoken to with such naked contempt and prejudice. The other executives watched the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort, but none of them intervened. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation, "your presence here is completely inappropriate. This is a private corporate meeting involving sensitive business information. The fact that someone dressed like that can just walk into our most secure conference room is a serious security breach." Marcus remained standing in the doorway, his dignity intact despite the verbal assault. "I understand your concerns about security," he said quietly. "But I think if you'd allow me to explain—" "Explain what?" Victoria interrupted, her voice reaching a crescendo of disgust. "Explain how someone who obviously can't afford proper clothing thinks they have the right to interrupt a meeting of corporate executives. Explain how you managed to sneak past security looking like you just crawled out of an alley." She paused dramatically, scanning the room to ensure she had everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the problem I've been describing. When we allow our standards to slip, when we become too lenient about who we permit in our building, this is what happens." Marcus felt something cold and hard settling in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but a profound disappointment in seeing the true nature of the person he'd entrusted with significant responsibility in his company. "Sir," Victoria said, her tone now becoming mockingly patient, as if she were speaking to a child, "I'm going to help you understand something very important. This building, this company, represents excellence. We work with Fortune 500 clients. We manage billions of dollars in assets. Our employees wear $1,000 suits and drive luxury cars." She gestured around the room at the other executives, most of whom were looking increasingly uncomfortable but remained silent. "Do you see anyone else in this room who looks like you?" Victoria asked. Do you see anyone else dripping rainwater on our carpet? Do you see anyone else dressed like they shop at thrift stores? The silence stretched on, thick with tension and embarrassment. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every stare in the room. But beneath the humiliation, something else was building. Not rage, but a crystalline clarity about who Victoria Sterling really was beneath her polished exterior. The answer is no, Victoria continued, when Marcus didn't respond. Because we have standards here. We have expectations. And unfortunately, you don't meet them. Jennifer Walsh looked like she wanted to say something, her mouth opening slightly, but she caught Victoria's warning glare and remained silent. Daniel Rodriguez was staring at his hands, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge Victoria's authority. Now, Victoria said, moving closer to Marcus with predatory confidence, I'm going to give you two choices. You can leave this building immediately and never come back, or I can call security to escort you out. Either way, your little adventure ends right now. Marcus looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of each executive present. Some looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. Others watched with curiosity, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. But none of them spoke up to defend him or question Victoria's behavior. I see, Marcus said quietly. And if I choose to stay? Victoria's smile was sharp and unforgiving. Then you'll discover exactly how serious we are about maintaining our standards. She walked over to the conference room's side table, where a pitcher of ice water sat next to glasses for the meeting attendees. The sound of ice clinking against glass was the only noise in the room as she picked up the pitcher. You know what I think? Victoria said, turning back to face Marcus. I think you need to understand exactly how unwelcome you are here. I think you need a reminder of what happens when people like you try to insert themselves into places where they don't belong. What happened next would be talked about in corporate circles for years to come. Victoria Sterling, Vice President of Operations at Meridian Enterprises, walked deliberately across the conference room carrying the pitcher of ice water. Every executive in the room watched in stunned silence as she approached Marcus Chen, who stood quietly in the doorway, still dripping from the storm outside. Sometimes, Victoria said, her voice carrying a cruel satisfaction, actions speak louder than words. And with that, she upended the entire pitcher over Marcus's head. Ice-cold water cascaded down his face, soaking through his already damp clothes and splashing onto the floor around his feet. Ice cubes scattered across the carpet with small, sharp sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the absolute silence that followed. Marcus stood completely still, water streaming down his face and dripping from his hair. He didn't flinch, didn't cry out, didn't react with anger or shock. He simply stood there with quiet dignity as water pooled around his shoes and the last drops fell from the empty pitcher in Victoria's hands. The silence in the room was deafening. Every executive stared in horrified fascination at what had just occurred. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed, but none of them moved to intervene or protest Victoria's actions. There, Victoria said with cold satisfaction, setting the empty pitcher down on the conference table with a decisive clink. Now, maybe you'll understand that you don't belong here. Marcus slowly wiped water from his eyes with the back of his hand. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable, neither angry nor defeated, but somehow profoundly sad. Is that how you treat people in this company? He asked quietly. That's how I treat people who refuse to know their place, Victoria replied without hesitation. This building, this company, has standards, and you, whoever you are, fall far short of those standards. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, but still nobody spoke up. The corporate hierarchy was too rigid, Victoria's authority too established, for anyone to risk challenging her in front of the group. Furthermore, Victoria continued, emboldened by the lack of resistance, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what happens when people like you try to push yourselves into spaces where you're not wanted. Maybe next time you'll think twice before attempting to crash a meeting of your betters. Marcus nodded slowly, as if processing her words carefully. I see, he said. So this is the culture you've created here. This is the culture of excellence and accountability, Victoria corrected sharply. This is what happens when standards matter more than misguided political correctness. She turned to address the other executives, gesturing toward Marcus as if he were an object lesson. Let this be a reminder to all of us about the importance of maintaining our professional environment. When we allow our standards to slip, when we become too tolerant of mediocrity, this is what we get. Random people thinking they can just walk into our meetings. Marcus stood there for another moment, water still dripping from his clothes and forming an expanding puddle beneath his feet. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the conference room. The sound of his wet footsteps echoed down the hallway until they faded entirely, leaving the executives in complete silence. For several long seconds, nobody in the conference room spoke. The weight of what had just occurred seemed to settle over them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Jennifer Walsh cleared her throat. "Victoria," she said hesitantly, "don't you think that was a bit extreme?" Victoria whirled around to face her, eyes flashing with irritation. "Extreme? Jennifer, that was necessary. Someone needed to show that man that actions have consequences. Someone needed to demonstrate that this company won't tolerate disruptions from inappropriate individuals. But we don't even know who he was," Daniel Rodriguez said quietly. "What if he was here for a legitimate reason?" "Legitimate reason?" Victoria laughed harshly. "Daniel, look around this room. Look at how we're dressed, how we present ourselves. Does anything about that man suggest he had a legitimate reason to be in an executive meeting? Use your common sense." Robert Kim nodded in agreement. "Victoria's right. The guy clearly didn't belong here. Better to be safe than sorry when it comes to corporate security. Still," Jennifer persisted, "humiliating someone like that seems unnecessarily cruel." Victoria's expression hardened. "Jennifer, I'm going to say this once, and I hope you'll listen carefully. This company succeeds because we maintain standards. We don't succeed by coddling every person who wanders through our doors looking for sympathy." She moved back to her position at the head of the conference table, clearly considering the matter closed. "Now, let's get back to business. We have actual work to do, and we've already wasted too much time on this distraction." But several of the executives found it difficult to focus on the remainder of the meeting. The image of water cascading over the quiet stranger's head and his dignified response to such humiliation lingered in their minds. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen made his way down the hallway toward the elevator, leaving a trail of water droplets behind him. He passed several employees who stared curiously at his soaked appearance, but he ignored their looks and continued walking with steady purpose. When the elevator doors closed, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Sarah," he said when the call connected, "it's Marcus. I need you to arrange an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. All directors, all senior management, no exceptions." Sarah Mitchell, his executive assistant, could hear something in his voice that she'd never heard before. "Of course, Mr. Chen. May I ask what this is regarding?" "Corporate culture," Marcus replied simply, "and accountability." After hanging up, Marcus stood in the elevator as it descended toward the parking garage. Water continued to drip from his clothes, but his mind was already working through what needed to happen next. The humiliation he'd just experienced wasn't about him personally. It was symptomatic of something much larger and more troubling within his own company. He thought about Victoria Sterling's words, her casual cruelty, her assumptions about worth and value based solely on appearance. He thought about the other executives who had witnessed her behavior and chosen to remain silent. Most importantly, he thought about all the employees throughout Meridian Enterprises who might be subjected to similar treatment when no one was watching. The elevator reached the parking garage, and Marcus walked to his car, a modest sedan that he preferred over the luxury vehicles his position could afford. As he sat in the driver's seat, still dripping water onto the leather upholstery, he made a decision that would change everything. The next 24 hours would reveal truths that would shake Meridian Enterprises to its very foundation. The following morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the previous day's storm having washed the city clean. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Enterprises' main boardroom as executives began filing in for what they'd been told was an emergency leadership meeting. Victoria Sterling arrived precisely on time, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that spoke of both authority and expensive taste. She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted her place in the corporate hierarchy. The events of the previous day seemed to have only reinforced her sense of righteousness about maintaining company standards. "Good morning, everyone," she said brightly, as she took her usual seat near the head of the long mahogany table. "I hope we can keep this brief." I have a client presentation at 10. The other executives who had witnessed yesterday's confrontation filed in with varying degrees of discomfort. Jennifer Walsh looked troubled, her usually bright demeanor subdued. Daniel Rodriguez appeared nervous, constantly checking his watch and shifting in his chair. Even Robert Kim, who had supported Victoria's actions, seemed less certain in the clear light of morning. "Has anyone heard what this is about?" asked Thomas Bradley, the director of international operations, who hadn't been present for the previous day's incident. "Probably just quarterly reviews," Victoria replied dismissively. "You know how corporate loves their surprise meetings." At exactly 9 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened, and Sarah Mitchell entered carrying a stack of documents. Behind her walked a figure that made several executives do double takes. It was Marcus Chen, but he looked completely different from the soaked, humble man they'd encountered yesterday. Today, he wore a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, Italian leather shoes, and a watch that cost more than most people's cars. His hair was professionally styled, and he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Victoria glanced up from her phone as he entered, then looked again more carefully. Something about the man seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place him. The transformation was so complete that she didn't immediately connect him to yesterday's incident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced, "the chairman and chief executive officer, Marcus Chen." The words hit the room like a physical force. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. The silence was so complete that the air conditioning system seemed unnaturally loud. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, dawning horror. Her phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered onto the conference table. Marcus took his place at the head of the table, the position that had always been his by right, but which he rarely used. He looked around the room calmly, meeting each executive's eyes in turn. When his gaze reached Victoria, she seemed to shrink in her chair. "Thank you all for attending on short notice," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "I called this meeting to address a serious matter concerning our corporate culture and values." Jennifer Walsh stared at Marcus with growing recognition and mounting embarrassment. Daniel Rodriguez had gone pale, clearly understanding the implications of what was about to unfold. Several executives who hadn't been present for yesterday's meeting looked confused, but they could sense the tension crackling through the room. "Yesterday," Marcus continued, "I conducted an unscheduled observation of our monthly leadership meeting. What I witnessed has prompted me to call into question some fundamental assumptions about how this company operates." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She seemed frozen, caught between denial and the slowly dawning realization of the magnitude of her mistake. "During my observation," Marcus said, "I heard disturbing conversations about implementing appearance-based discrimination in our workplace. I heard executives discussing the need to exclude people who don't meet certain aesthetic standards. Most concerning of all, I witnessed behavior that runs counter to every value this company was founded upon." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence stretched taut with anticipation and dread. "Victoria," Marcus said, turning his attention directly to the vice president of operations, "would you like to share with the board your thoughts on workplace standards?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her face had gone white, except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. She looked around the room desperately, as if seeking some escape route, but found only the stares of her colleagues. I don't understand," she managed to whisper. "You don't understand?" Marcus asked, his tone remaining perfectly calm and professional. "Let me help clarify. Yesterday, you advocated for judging employees and visitors based solely on their appearance. You suggested that people who look unprofessional or unsuitable don't belong in our building. Do you remember that conversation?" Victoria's breathing had become shallow and rapid. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "You also," Marcus continued, "had an encounter with a visitor to our conference room, someone you felt didn't meet your standards. Can you describe that encounter for the board?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Victoria's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the conference table. Around the room, other executives who had witnessed the incident looked sick with understanding. "Please," Victoria whispered, so quietly that several people had to lean forward to hear her. "I didn't know. I had no idea who you were." That's precisely the point, Marcus replied. You didn't know who I was. You made assumptions based entirely on my appearance. You decided my worth, my right to be here, my basic human dignity, based on the fact that I was wet from the rain and wearing modest clothes. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly around the conference table, his footsteps echoing in the silence. But let's be specific about what happened, Marcus continued. You didn't just ask me to leave. You didn't just question my presence. You humiliated me. You deliberately poured ice water over my head to teach me my place, as you put it. Several executives gasped audibly. Those who hadn't witnessed the incident looked shocked, while those who had been present appeared ready to disappear into their chairs. Furthermore, Marcus said, you did this in front of 12 other senior executives, not one of whom intervened or objected to your behavior. This suggests that the problem extends beyond individual prejudice to systemic cultural issues within our leadership team. Thomas Bradley looked confused and horrified. Victoria, you poured water on the CEO? Victoria couldn't answer. Tears were streaming down her face as the full weight of her actions crashed over her. Marcus returned to his position at the head of the table. The question before us now is not just what to do about yesterday's incident, but what it reveals about our company's values and culture. If our senior leadership believes it's acceptable to humiliate people based on their appearance, what message does that send to our employees? What kind of workplace are we creating? He activated the large screen at the far end of the conference room, displaying a presentation he'd prepared during the previous evening. I spent last night reviewing our employee satisfaction surveys, our diversity and inclusion metrics, and our customer feedback ratings. What I found was troubling but not entirely surprising. The first slide showed employee satisfaction scores that had been declining steadily over the past 2 years. The second displayed increasing complaints about workplace harassment and discrimination. The third revealed that several major clients had expressed concerns about the company's cultural atmosphere. It appears, Marcus said, that yesterday's incident was not an isolated event, but rather a symptom of broader problems within our organization. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. Mr. Chen, I am so deeply sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I would never have, if I had known. But that's exactly the problem, Victoria. Marcus interrupted gently. Your behavior was contingent on my identity, not on basic human decency. You treated me with cruelty not because of anything I had done, but because you perceived me as powerless. He clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics about workplace discrimination and its impact on corporate performance. Research consistently demonstrates that companies with inclusive cultures outperform their competitors in virtually every metric: innovation, productivity, employee retention, customer satisfaction, all improve when organizations embrace diversity and reject prejudice. Marcus looked around the room at his assembled executives. We have a choice to make as a leadership team. We can continue down the path that led to yesterday's incident, or we can recommit to the values that built this company. Jennifer Walsh raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Chen, I want to apologize. I should have spoken up yesterday. I should have intervened when the incident occurred. I failed as a leader and as a human being. Thank you for acknowledging that, Jennifer, Marcus replied. Leadership requires moral courage, especially in difficult moments. Yesterday, that courage was absent from our conference room. Daniel Rodriguez cleared his throat. Sir, I also want to apologize. I was uncomfortable with Victoria's behavior, but I chose silence over action. That was cowardly and wrong. One by one, the executives who had witnessed the incident offered their apologies and admissions of failure. The weight of collective shame settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Victoria sat in stunned silence as her colleagues acknowledged their complicity in her actions. She realized that she had not only destroyed her own career, but had also exposed the moral failures of the entire leadership team. These apologies are a start, Marcus said, but words without action are meaningless. We need systemic changes to ensure that yesterday's incident never happens again. He clicked to a new slide, outlining a comprehensive cultural transformation plan. Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory unconscious bias training for all employees. We will establish an anonymous reporting system for discrimination complaints. We will review and revise all policies to ensure they promote inclusion rather than exclusion. The next slide detailed changes to hiring and promotion practices, emphasizing merit-based evaluation and diverse candidate pools. Additionally, Marcus continued, we will be bringing in external consultants to conduct a thorough cultural audit. Every department, every team, every manager will be evaluated on their commitment to inclusive leadership. Victoria raised her hand with visible effort. Mr. Chen, I understand that my actions were unforgivable. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Victoria, your behavior yesterday was indeed unacceptable. But terminating you without addressing the underlying cultural issues would be treating the symptom rather than the disease. He clicked to the final slide of his presentation. Instead, I'm implementing a different consequence. You will be enrolled in an intensive leadership development program focused on empathy, inclusion, and unconscious bias. You will spend the next 6 months working directly with our employee resource groups, learning from people whose experiences differ from your own. Victoria's eyes widened with surprise. You're not firing me? I'm giving you an opportunity to become the leader this company needs, Marcus replied. But make no mistake, this is your only opportunity. Any future incidents of discrimination or prejudice will result in immediate termination. He turned to address the entire room. The same standard applies to everyone in this room. We will measure your performance not just on financial metrics, but on your commitment to creating an inclusive workplace culture. Thomas Bradley raised his hand. Mr. Chen, what about the employees who weren't involved in yesterday's incident? How do we ensure they understand the seriousness of these changes? Excellent question, Marcus replied. We'll be holding company-wide assemblies to discuss these cultural changes. I'll be sharing my own experience from yesterday, anonymously at first, to help employees understand why these changes are necessary. The meeting continued for another hour as Marcus outlined specific implementation timelines, accountability measures, and success metrics. By the time it concluded, every executive in the room understood that Meridian Enterprises was embarking on a fundamental transformation. As the meeting ended and executives began filing out, Victoria remained seated, staring at her hands. Marcus approached her directly. Victoria, he said quietly, I want you to understand something. Yesterday's incident was hurtful and humiliating, but it also provided a valuable lesson about our company's true culture. I'm giving you the chance to be part of the solution, rather than remaining part of the problem. Victoria looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Mr. Chen, I don't understand why you're being so generous. I treated you with unconscionable cruelty. Because, Marcus replied, transformation requires grace as well as accountability. Yesterday you showed me who you are when you think no one important is watching. Now I want to see who you can become when you choose to be better. He handed her a business card. This is Dr. Patricia Williams, the leadership coach who will be working with you. Your first session is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Victoria took the card with shaking hands. I won't let you down, Mr. Chen. I promise. Don't make promises to me, Marcus said. Make commitments to yourself and to the employees who deserve better leadership. Over the following weeks, word of the incident and its aftermath spread throughout Meridian Enterprises. The story was told and retold, evolving with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. The company was serious about creating an inclusive culture where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. Victoria Sterling threw herself into the leadership development program with the fervor of someone seeking redemption. She attended every session with Dr. Williams, participated actively in employee resource group meetings, and gradually began to understand how her privileges and assumptions had shaped her worldview. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate. There were moments of resistance, occasions when her old patterns of thinking reasserted themselves. But slowly, painfully, she began to develop the empathy and self-awareness that had been lacking in her leadership style. 3 months after the incident, Victoria was assigned to mentor a group of new employees from diverse backgrounds. Among them was David Martinez, a brilliant analyst who had grown up in poverty and worked his way through college while supporting his family. During one of their mentoring sessions, David shared his experiences with workplace discrimination and the subtle ways that classism manifested in corporate environments. As he spoke about feeling invisible and undervalued despite his qualifications, Victoria felt a profound recognition of her own past behavior. David, she said when he finished, I want to share something with you. A few months ago, I was exactly the kind of leader who would have overlooked your talents because of assumptions about your background. She went on to describe the incident with Marcus Chen, taking full responsibility for her actions and explaining how the experience had forced her to confront her own prejudices. The CEO gave me a second chance I didn't deserve, Victoria concluded. Now, I want to make sure that talented people like you never have to face the kind of discrimination I once perpetuated. David listened with growing amazement. You're the VP who poured water on Mr. Chen? Victoria nodded, shame still evident in her expression. That was the lowest moment of my professional life, but it was also the beginning of becoming a better leader. From that conversation forward, David became one of Victoria's strongest advocates within the company. He had witnessed firsthand her genuine commitment to change, and his endorsement carried significant weight with other employees who had been skeptical of her transformation. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen continued his own journey of discovery about his company's culture. He implemented a practice of regular walks through different departments, sometimes in his executive attire and sometimes in more casual clothing, observing how employees were treated based on their perceived status. The differences were stark and troubling. When he appeared as the polished CEO, employees were deferential and accommodating. When he dressed more modestly, he was often ignored or treated dismissively by the same people who had been obsequious in other circumstances. These observations informed a series of policy changes designed to address systemic inequalities within the organization. Meridian Enterprises implemented blind resume reviews for hiring, established clear criteria for promotions based on performance rather than presentation, and created multiple pathways for employee feedback and recognition. 6 months after the initial incident, the company's employee satisfaction scores had improved dramatically. Turnover rates dropped, productivity increased, and customer feedback reflected the improved workplace culture. But perhaps the most significant change was in Victoria Sterling herself. The woman who had once judged others based on appearance had become a passionate advocate for inclusive leadership. She spoke at industry conferences about the importance of unconscious bias training, mentored employees from underrepresented groups, and worked tirelessly to ensure that Meridian Enterprises became a model for corporate transformation. During the company's annual leadership retreat, Marcus Chen addressed the assembled executives about the journey they'd taken together. "A year ago," he said, "we discovered that our company had drifted from its foundational values. We had allowed prejudice and elitism to take root in our culture. The incident that exposed these problems was painful, but it also provided an opportunity for growth." He looked around the room at faces that had become more thoughtful, more inclusive, more aware of their impact on others. "True leadership," Marcus continued, "isn't about maintaining power over others. It's about empowering others to reach their full potential. It's about creating environments where talent can flourish regardless of background, appearance, or circumstances." Victoria Sterling raised her hand. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to share something with the group, if you don't mind." Marcus nodded for her to continue. "A year ago, I was the worst kind of leader, someone who used position and privilege to diminish others rather than lift them up. The incident with Mr. Chen forced me to confront ugly truths about myself that I had been avoiding." Her voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "The transformation process has been difficult and humbling, but it's also been the most important work of my professional life. I've learned that true strength comes from vulnerability, that real authority comes from service, and that the best leaders are those who recognize their own capacity for growth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I want to thank Mr. Chen, not just for the second chance he gave me, but for showing me what graceful leadership looks like. He could have destroyed my career with a single phone call. Instead, he chose to invest in my potential for change." The room erupted in applause, not just for Victoria's words, but for the transformation they represented. Here was a leader who had fallen from grace, but had chosen to rebuild herself on a foundation of humility and service. Marcus Chen stood to respond. "Victoria, your journey demonstrates something profound about human nature, our capacity for growth, learning, and redemption. But the real test isn't in this room among fellow executives. It's in how we treat the newest employee, the maintenance worker, the intern, the visitor who doesn't look like they belong." He activated the presentation screen one final time, displaying a quote that had become the company's unofficial motto. Judge not by appearance but by character, not by privilege but by potential, not by position but by purpose. This quote, Marcus said, was suggested by Maria Santos, one of our custodial staff members, during a company-wide feedback session. Maria reminded us that wisdom and insight come from all levels of our organization, not just the executive suite. The executives applauded again, this time for Maria's contribution to their corporate philosophy. As the retreat concluded, Victoria Sterling approached Marcus Chen privately. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I have a question I've been wanting to ask for months." "What's that, Victoria?" "When you were standing in that conference room, soaking wet from the rain and then from the water I poured on you, what were you thinking? I've tried to imagine what was going through your mind during that moment." Marcus considered the question carefully. "I was thinking about my grandmother," he said finally. Victoria looked surprised. "Your grandmother?" "She worked as a domestic worker for wealthy families her entire life," Marcus explained. "She was brilliant, insightful, and kind, but she was invisible to most of the people she served. They saw her uniform, her accent, her social status, but they never saw her humanity." His voice grew soft with memory. "When you poured that water over my head, I realized that despite all my success, despite building this company from nothing, I could still be reduced to invisibility in the eyes of someone who judged by appearance rather than character." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Chen. I became exactly the kind of person who would have dismissed your grandmother." "But you're not that person anymore," Marcus replied. "That's the power of conscious growth and intentional change. We don't have to remain prisoners of our past assumptions and prejudices." He handed her an envelope. "There's something I want you to have." Victoria opened the envelope to find a photograph of an elderly Asian woman in a housekeeper's uniform, standing beside a young boy in school clothes. "That's my grandmother, Elena Chen, and me on my first day of high school. She saved every penny she could to buy me that uniform and backpack. She believed that education was the path to dignity and opportunity." Victoria studied the photograph, seeing the love and pride in the older woman's eyes. "Elena never lived to see me build this company," Marcus continued, "but her values are woven into everything we do here. She taught me that a person's worth has nothing to do with their job title or bank account, and everything to do with how they treat others." Victoria carefully placed the photograph back in the envelope. "Thank you for sharing this with me. I'll treasure it. More importantly," Marcus said, "I hope you'll remember it. When you're faced with someone who looks different, sounds different, or comes from different circumstances, I hope you'll think about Elena Chen and all the other invisible people whose contributions make our success possible." As the months passed, the story of Marcus Chen and Victoria Sterling became legendary within business circles, not as a tale of comeuppance or revenge, but as an example of transformative leadership and the power of second chances. Victoria went on to become one of the industry's most respected voices on inclusive leadership, speaking frequently about the importance of examining unconscious bias and creating equitable workplace cultures. Her transformation was so complete and authentic that she was eventually promoted to Chief People Officer, a role in which she championed the very values she had once violated. Marcus Chen continued to lead Meridian Enterprises with quiet dignity and unwavering commitment to justice and inclusion. Under his leadership, the company became a model for corporate social responsibility, attracting top talent from diverse backgrounds and consistently ranking among the best places to work in multiple industry surveys. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that rainy day incident was the ripple effect it created throughout the business community. The story spread, evolved, and inspired countless conversations about leadership, prejudice, and the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their apparent station in life. Years later, business schools would use the case study of Meridian Enterprises' cultural transformation as an example of how crisis can become catalyst, how individual growth can drive organizational change, and how the most powerful form of leadership is often quiet, graceful, and focused on empowering others. The conference room where Victoria Sterling had poured water over Marcus Chen's head was eventually renovated and renamed the Elena Chen Conference Room, honoring the woman whose values had shaped her grandson's approach to leadership. A plaque by the door reminded all who entered, "True dignity lies not in never falling, but in how we choose to rise." Victoria Sterling would often pause at that plaque during her daily rounds through the office, remembering the person she had been and reaffirming her commitment to the person she had chosen to become. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every difficult moment. And in boardrooms across the city, executives who had heard the story found themselves pausing before making assumptions about others, remembering that appearances can deceive, that worth isn't determined by wardrobe, and that the most important qualities in any person are often invisible to the casual observer. The rain had stopped falling long ago, but the lessons it had revealed continued to nourish growth, understanding, and hope for a more just and inclusive world. 2 years after the incident, Marcus Chen received an unexpected phone call that would test everything the company had learned about transformation and second chances. "Mr. Chen," his secretary Sarah announced over the intercom, "there's a young woman here to see you. She says her name is Isabella Rodriguez, and she's Victoria Sterling's daughter." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that Victoria had a family, but they had never discussed her personal life in detail during the transformation process. The fact that her daughter was here, unannounced, suggested something significant was happening. "Send her in, please," Marcus replied, steeling himself for whatever revelation was about to unfold. Isabella Rodriguez entered the office with hesitant steps, bearing a striking resemblance to her mother, but carrying herself with an uncertainty that Victoria had never displayed. She was perhaps 22 years old, dressed professionally but modestly, and her eyes held a mixture of determination and apprehension that Marcus recognized from his own youth. "Mr. Chen," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know you must be very busy." "Not at all, Isabella. Please have a seat." "How can I help you?" Isabella settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk, clutching a worn leather portfolio in her lap. "Mr. Chen, I need to tell you something about my mother, about the day she humiliated you in that conference room." Marcus leaned forward, sensing that this conversation was about to reveal another layer of complexity to an already profound story. "I want you to know," Isabella continued, "that the woman who poured water on your head was not the mother who raised me. Something had changed in her during the months leading up to that incident. She had become someone I barely recognized." Isabella opened her portfolio and pulled out a series of medical documents. "3 days before she attacked you, my mother received a diagnosis that she kept secret from everyone at work. She had been experiencing personality changes, memory issues, and uncharacteristic aggression for several months." Marcus examined the documents with growing concern. They showed that Victoria had been diagnosed with a brain tumor, a condition that could indeed cause dramatic personality changes and impaired judgment. "She was scheduled for surgery the week after your board meeting," Isabella explained, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She was terrified that if the company knew about her condition, she would lose her job, and our family would lose our healthcare coverage." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Throughout Victoria's transformation and redemption arc, she had been fighting not just against her own prejudices, but against a medical condition that was literally changing her brain chemistry. "Isabella," Marcus said softly, "why didn't your mother tell me this during our conversations about her development program?" "Because she was ashamed," Isabella replied. "She said that regardless of what was happening in her brain, her actions were inexcusable. She didn't want the medical condition to be seen as an excuse for treating you with such cruelty." Isabella pulled out another document, a letter written in Victoria's handwriting. "She wrote this letter to you the night before her surgery," Isabella said, handing it to Marcus. "She asked me to deliver it only if something went wrong during the operation." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. Victoria's familiar handwriting covered 3 pages of elegant stationery. "Dear Mr. Chen," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that I did not survive the surgery to remove my brain tumor. I cannot bear the thought of leaving this world without ensuring you know the full truth about my actions and the incredible gift you gave me in the aftermath." Marcus continued reading, his emotions growing more complex with each paragraph. "The doctors tell me that the tumor may have been affecting my personality and judgment for months before our encounter in the conference room. This knowledge has brought me no comfort, because I know that medical conditions can explain behavior, but they cannot excuse it. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what internal struggles their oppressor might be facing." The letter went on to detail Victoria's experience during the transformation program, her growing understanding of inclusive leadership, and her gratitude for the chance to rebuild herself into someone worthy of her position. "What you gave me, Mr. Chen, was not just a second chance. It was the opportunity to discover who I could become when I chose to be better than my circumstances. The leadership program, the mentoring experiences, the constant examination of my own prejudices. These things helped me grow beyond what the tumor was trying to make me become. Marcus looked up at Isabella, who was watching his face carefully as he read. "Your mother survived the surgery," he said. "She's been cancer-free for over a year now." Isabella nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The surgery was successful, and the personality changes have largely resolved. But she says the person she became during the transformation program, that's who she wants to remain. She says the tumor may have triggered her worst impulses, but overcoming those impulses required conscious choice and constant effort." Marcus set the letter down carefully. "Isabella, why are you showing me this now? Why didn't Victoria come herself?" "Because she's in the hospital again," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "Not for the tumor, that's gone. But yesterday, she collapsed at work. The doctors say it's stress-related, brought on by months of pushing herself to prove that she's worthy of the second chance you gave her." The irony was devastating. Victoria had worked so hard to transform herself and prove her worth that she had literally made herself sick with the effort. "She's been working 18-hour days," Isabella continued, "taking on extra projects, mentoring twice as many employees as anyone else, speaking at conferences every weekend. She's trying so hard to make up for that one terrible moment that she's destroying her health." Marcus stood up from his desk and walked to the window, processing this new information. The woman he had believed was finding perfect balance and redemption was actually struggling with a different kind of self-destructive behavior. "Isabella," he said finally, "what would you like me to do?" "I want you to go see her," Isabella replied. "I want you to tell her that she doesn't have to earn your forgiveness over and over again. I want you to help her understand that redemption doesn't require self-destruction." Within an hour, Marcus was standing in Victoria's hospital room, looking at a woman who had lost considerable weight and appeared exhausted beyond her years. Victoria's eyes widened in shock when she saw him enter. "Mr. Chen," she whispered, struggling to sit up in the hospital bed. "You shouldn't be here. I'm fine, really. I'll be back to work tomorrow." "Victoria," Marcus said gently, pulling a chair close to her bed, "your daughter showed me your letter, the one you wrote before your surgery." Victoria's face went pale. "She wasn't supposed to. I told her only if—" "I know," Marcus interrupted, "but I'm glad she did. We need to talk about what redemption actually means." Over the next hour, Marcus and Victoria had one of the most honest conversations of their relationship. Victoria revealed the crushing weight of guilt she carried, not just from the original incident, but from the knowledge that her brain tumor may have been influencing her behavior for months before their confrontation. "I keep wondering," Victoria said, "how many other people I hurt during that time. How many employees felt the impact of my condition without anyone realizing what was happening." Marcus listened as Victoria described her compulsive need to prove herself, her fear that any sign of weakness would confirm that she didn't deserve her position, and her belief that she had to be perfect to justify the grace she had been shown. "Victoria," Marcus said when she finished, "do you remember what I told you about my grandmother Elena?" Victoria nodded weakly. "Elena used to say that forgiveness is not something you earn, it's something you accept. The more you try to prove you deserve it, the more you miss the point of receiving it in the first place." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a framed photograph, the same picture of Elena that he had shown Victoria years earlier. "My grandmother had a brain aneurysm when I was 15, Marcus continued. "For 6 months before it was diagnosed, she became someone I didn't recognize. She was angry, paranoid, and sometimes cruel to the very people she loved most. When we found out about the medical cause, I spent years feeling guilty for being angry at her during that time." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the parallel. "But eventually I learned that loving someone means accepting their humanity, including their medical struggles, their mistakes, and their imperfections. Elena didn't need to earn my love back after her recovery. She had never lost it." Marcus set the photograph on Victoria's bedside table. "The same principle applies to redemption in the workplace. You don't have to work yourself to death to prove you're worthy of a second chance. You just have to accept that you've already been given one." Victoria broke down completely, sobbing with a mixture of relief and exhaustion that had been building for months. For the first time since the original incident, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened without the compulsive need to immediately fix or compensate for it. "Mr. Chen," she said when she could speak again, "I don't know how to stop trying to earn what I've already been given. That's why we're going to modify your role at the company," Marcus replied. "You're going to take a 3-month medical leave to recover fully. When you return, you'll be transitioning to a new position I'm creating, Director of Leadership Wellness." Victoria looked confused. "I don't understand. Your experience, both with unconscious bias and with the health challenges that can affect decision-making, has given you unique insights into leadership development. I want you to create programs that help other executives recognize when they're struggling, whether from stress, health issues, or personal challenges that might be affecting their judgment." Marcus pulled out a job description he had drafted during the drive to the hospital. "This role will involve working with employees at all levels who are facing similar challenges. You'll help create support systems for leaders who are dealing with health issues, family crises, or other circumstances that might impact their work performance." Victoria read through the description with growing amazement. "You're not punishing me for being sick. You're turning my experience into a way to help others." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "True redemption isn't about perfect performance. It's about using our struggles to create value for others facing similar challenges." The new role would require Victoria to work normal hours, take mandatory breaks, and focus on sustainable leadership practices rather than perfectionist overachievement. It was a complete reversal of the self-destructive pattern she had fallen into. 3 months later, Victoria returned to work as Director of Leadership Wellness. Her first initiative was a company-wide program called Invisible Struggles, designed to help employees recognize when colleagues might be dealing with health issues, family problems, or other challenges that could affect their behavior. The program was revolutionary in its approach. Rather than simply punishing poor behavior, it created pathways for employees to get help when they were struggling. Medical leave policies were expanded, mental health resources were enhanced, and managers were trained to recognize signs of distress in their team members. Victoria's own story became a cornerstone of the program, though she was careful to emphasize that medical conditions could explain behavior, but never excuse harmful actions toward others. The goal, Victoria explained during the program's launch presentation, is not to create excuses for poor behavior, but to create support systems that prevent good people from making terrible mistakes when they're struggling. The program's impact extended far beyond Meridian Enterprises. Other companies began implementing similar initiatives, recognizing that supporting employees through difficult times was not just compassionate, but also good business practice. Dr. Patricia Williams, the leadership coach who had worked with Victoria during her initial transformation, was brought in to help design training modules for the new program. During one of their planning sessions, she made an observation that would shape the program's philosophy. "Victoria," Dr. Williams said, "your story demonstrates something profound about human resilience. You've been through 3 distinct transformations: overcoming unconscious bias, surviving a serious illness, and learning to accept grace rather than earning it. Each phase required different skills and insights." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's why this work feels so meaningful. I understand that people can change, but I also understand how difficult and complex that change can be." The Invisible Struggles program eventually expanded to include support for employees dealing with financial stress, caregiving responsibilities, addiction recovery, and other life challenges that could impact work performance. Victoria worked with each department to create individualized support plans that maintained high standards while providing compassionate assistance. One of the most successful components was a peer mentoring system where employees who had overcome various challenges were paired with colleagues facing similar struggles. Victoria often served as a mentor herself, sharing her experience with other leaders who were dealing with health issues or recovering from professional mistakes. The program helped dozens of employees facing various challenges, from health issues to family crises. Each success story reinforced the value of supporting people through difficult times, rather than simply punishing poor performance. 5 years after the original incident, Marcus Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the National Leadership Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address about transformative leadership. In the front row sat Victoria Sterling, healthy and radiant, surrounded by dozens of employees whose lives had been touched by the programs she had developed. Leadership, Marcus began, is not about maintaining an image of perfection. It's about having the courage to face our imperfections and transform them into sources of strength for others. He told the story of his own humiliation and Victoria's redemption, but he also shared the deeper lessons about health, stress, and the importance of creating supportive workplace cultures. True leadership, Marcus continued, recognizes that every person is fighting battles we cannot see. Our job as leaders is not to judge those battles, but to create environments where people can get the help they need to fight them successfully. The audience was captivated by the story's complexity, how a moment of cruelty had revealed not just personal prejudice, but also institutional gaps in supporting struggling employees. They were inspired by Victoria's multiple transformations and the innovative programs that had emerged from her experience. During the question and answer session, a young executive raised her hand. Mr. Chen, how do you balance accountability with compassion when dealing with employee mistakes? Marcus looked at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. Accountability and compassion are not opposing forces, he replied. True accountability includes taking responsibility for creating conditions that support people's success. When someone makes a mistake, our first question should not be, how do we punish this? But, how do we prevent this from happening again? Victoria stood up to add her perspective. From my experience on both sides of this equation, I can tell you that consequences are important, but they're most effective when they're designed to promote growth rather than just punishment. The goal should always be restoration, both for the person who made the mistake and for those who were harmed by it. After the conference, Marcus and Victoria reflected on their journey together. The principles that emerged from that difficult day continued to create positive change in countless lives across many organizations. The Elena Chen Conference Room became a pilgrimage site of sorts for executives studying inclusive leadership. The plaque by the door was supplemented by a display case containing Victoria's original letter to Marcus, examples of employee feedback from the Invisible Struggles program, and testimonials from other organizations that had implemented similar initiatives. Most importantly, the principles that emerged from that difficult day continued to create positive change in countless lives. Employees who might have been fired for struggles beyond their control instead received support that helped them become more effective leaders. Organizations that might have maintained cultures of perfectionism instead embraced approaches that valued growth and resilience. Marcus Chen continued to lead with quiet dignity, and Victoria Sterling became a respected speaker on leadership development. Their story became a template for organizational transformation, showing how crisis could become catalyst, how individual growth could drive systemic change, and how the most profound leadership lessons often emerged from moments of profound failure. The lesson was simple but profound. True leadership is not about power over others, but about empowering others to become their best selves, especially when they're struggling to find their way.